Well, good morning and or afternoon as the case may be, and welcome to our Canadian Tech Trends 2021 Unveil session. My name is Dalibor Petrovic. I am a partner at Deloitte, and I have a pleasure of hosting this series of sessions that we are bringing to you live. This morning, I am joined by two of my dear colleagues and friends and people I genuinely look up to for the coolness of their roles in our firm. Mike Bechtel, who is the Deloitte's chief futurist, and Scott Buchholz, who is the Deloitte's both chief technology officer and also the lead author of our Tech Trends series. And we are really grateful for them finding the time to spend the next hour with us, sharing the Deloitte Tech Trends for 2021. We're going to give you a moment for those of us who are still needing some time to click on the link and join the session. I would just like to also announce that this is going to be actually a series of conversations, and it will unfold over the next month and a half, such that every 2 weeks at the same day and the same time, we'll be exploring groups of trends a little bit deeper. So today's session is going to provide an overview of all of the 9 trends. And we are going to describe essentially what the trend is, tell some client stories. And then 2 weeks from now, on February 17th, we are going to go deeper into the 3 trends that we collectively refer to as the heart of the enterprise. 2 weeks after that, on March the 3rd, we're going to explore more deeply the trends around data, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. And this will be, I think, a very, very relevant, extremely excited session. I'm very much looking forward to that one. I'm looking forward to all of them, but that one I think is going to be really, really interesting because there's some pretty cool things that are happening out there. And then 2 weeks after that, on March the 17th, we'll have the final session that will explore the 3 trends that are merging sort of physical and digital environment. So for those of you who have joined and registered for this session, following this session, I am going to send you emails that are going to include links so you can register for all of these other 3 sessions in the series, as well as the link to the full Tech Trends report, which is free for you to download from our Deloitte's Insights website. And with that, as I mentioned, my colleagues and friends, Michael and Scott, thank you very much. I'm going to pass the mic over to Mike for his brief introduction, and then to Scott, and then we'll roll into the topic of today. Before we do that, though, one last comment. We have envisioned this session to be a 45-minute long discussion and presentation on tech trends themselves, and we have accounted for about 15 minutes for question and answers. So please feel free to submit any questions or comments that you might have using the Q&A function of our Zoom platform. With that, thank you very much, Mike. Over to you.
Thanks, Dalibor. And it goes without saying that the gratitude and the friendship goes both ways. It's great to be able to hang out with you and with our closest digital friends here and talk tech trends. By way of brief introduction, Mike Bechtel. I'm a futurist. I focus on what's new and beyond that, what's next. Former venture capitalist, former emerging technology inventor, and just thrilled to spend time with you. And in turn, introduce my dear friend and colleague, Scott, who will get us started. Scott?
Yeah, hello, everyone. So Scott Buchholz, Dalibor, also thank you for the opportunity to speak with all of you today. It's always great, and I think your Sean Connery look is something that you're pulling off really well. But in the meantime, I have the privilege of being somebody who's been focused on emerging technologies and technology implementations for a couple of decades now. And these days, I have the privilege of leading our annual research report that we're going to go through and tell you a little bit more about. So with that, why don't we get started? Our research report is something that we've been doing now for 12 years. We try to look 18 to 24 months just over the horizon to figure out what is nascent today in technology and enterprise IT that's going to be at scale at that time. We look around the globe, we look across industries, and we try to find the things that we think are the most interesting to bring to you. We go through a fairly rigorous process to find all of that information and cull it down to find the trends and so forth. Some of the more interesting aspects of it, though, I think, or perhaps unusual, are that not just that we've been doing this for 12 years, and so we've gotten confident in our ability to be able to peer into the near future, but also that we publish it freely available on the internet. So for those of you who have a little bit of time and want to read the full report, you are welcome to read our svelte 166-page report. You can go download from Deloitte.com. I would also say that there are lots of other options in order to be able to consume things in shorter bits if you are so inclined. The other thing I would also add is that each trend, and part of the reason the report is so long, each trend contains client stories. We use stories from clients and organizations to help hold us accountable to actually making sure that our research is valid and the things that we think are going to happen are indeed happening. We do it as well to ensure that, or to try to help ensure that all of you can envision what a pragmatic journey might look like. So with that, we're going to share a little bit about our research. We've been doing this for a long time now. If you look at this diagram, you can see we've been focused on technology change for a long time. And one of the things that happened over that period of time was we started to realize as we were doing the research that there were recurring patterns. So as opposed to sort of a blizzard of buzzwords or a cacophony of change, what we started to realize is that there were in fact patterns we were seeing. And those patterns we started to call the macro forces. And Mike's going to tell you a little bit more about them in detail. But what we've learned is that using the idea of the macro forces actually helps us think more clearly about technology, ground our research in ways that makes it easier to see what's just over the horizon, and also make it make sense to not just all of us, but also all of you. And so that bar across the top, the colored bar that you can see, is actually our list of macro forces. And with that, Mike, would you like to tell people about them a little bit?
Yeah, surely, Scott. So as Scott said, the wrong way to focus on emerging tech is to memorize the 63 a la carte trends over the last decade. The right way is to take this step back through this long lens and say, it's pretty much been a march of maturity among these three dimensions that we as technologists have frankly known all our career, right? At the top, we have the interaction layer, how people interact with machines. And most of us for a generation have been moving from sit up, click and type, to lean back, right? Touch and swipe. And the emerging frontier is beyond the glass, right? Moving beyond phones or even watches into smart glasses, into smart speakers, into all manner of non-traditional things. Now, when you look at those non-traditional things, you say, boy, that's weird and different. But when you see it along this continuum, you start to say, I guess it's just part of that same march towards simplicity that we've been seeing on interaction for years, right? As it is with information. On the second tier, a generation of us have buttered our bread around data, analytics, insights. The coming generation of work is really around next level machine learning and AI that's not just providing the helpful insight, but it's injecting those decisions, those insights into business processes in real time. I have a friend who likes to say, the old analytics is C3PO, back of the cockpit, talking too much. Here's what you should have done. AI is Chewbacca. It grabs the controls and gets you out of harm's way, right? That's the progression on information. Computation is really the move from, local on-prem up to cloud, and beyond that, out to everyone, right? When we say distributed platforms, we we mean blockchain and blockchain-like technologies, right? The idea that we can't trust any one of us as much as we can trust all of us. And so the future of data is really one of distributed trust and authority. Now, none of this stuff, none of this Futurama works without a solid foundation that we call the business of technology, AKA the people and the org side, trust, managing risk, right? Managing the downside, and then core modernization, right? Which, can be characterized as paying down technical debt, or more optimistically as efforts to innovate at the core. And Scott will be teaching us about what we're seeing trend-wise in that in a second. So shall we move on?
Let's do it.
Great.
Okay, so this year our trends are divided into three groups of three. We have our heart of the enterprise trends. And these are things that we're seeing impact organizations at the heart of their mission, whether it's aligning on strategy, whether it's making sure the systems that support us are lean and mean and digitally enabled and do the things we need to do, and whether or not our back end and processes actually work together, right? Data, the art of the possible, is really all about the change that we're seeing in that space. Not everybody may realize the R2-D2 versus Chewbacca analogy that Mike gave from earlier. But I would say that, the spirit of we're seeing increasingly AI and machine learning move from the back of the house and helping humans do better to actually helping us make decisions and other things. The change that generates for how we manage data, and then what all of this means for security. I think, as we've all seen, security in the world is getting increasingly interesting. I think some of us yearn for boring in that regard. And so this is a little bit of how do we, what are the leading thinkers thinking about in terms of getting back to boring? And then last but not least, we've got a better experience inside and out. And here what we're seeing is the transition accelerated by COVID, but not driven by COVID, but accelerated by COVID, where people are saying, okay, what does the future of the office and the workplace really need to look like? And maybe we should, as opposed to saying that that is 10 years out, think that that's a couple of years out. How do we use the new technologies and the new comfort that people have developed with digital systems to rethink the way we do physical digital interactions? And then what does all of this mean for diversity, equity, and inclusion? So we're going to go through all of these relatively quickly, then we'll stop and take questions. And as Dalibor said, if you're interested in any one of these rows, there's going to be an upcoming session on the individual rows, and we're happy to dig in and tell you more then. So, Mike, over to you.
Great. On time, under budget, 32 minutes, 9 trends. Let's do this. So, strategy engineered, the first trend at the heart of the business, is really the recognition at our leading clients that technology strategy and business strategy are just strategy, right? And that they need not be separate disciplines. They need not be siloed. In fact, winning organizations recognize that data-driven, real-time decision-making needs to be the new normal, not just at the C-suite, but at the board level. Historically, strategy's been sort of a rarefied, cufflinks and hardcover book pursuit, right? Best practices, time-honored, thoughtful, but not necessarily agile, okay? The move, as Scott said so well, right? Not caused by COVID, but accelerated by COVID, is towards emergent and agile strategy development at the highest levels of the org that is driven not by legacy best practice, but by up-to-date sensing, scanning, scouting of the market. I'll give you an example. We had a discussion with the CTO of a large grocery delivery startup that you've all heard of. And he said, listen, we don't even have weekly meetings or any kind of meeting cadence as a C-suite, right? We have a dashboard. And when the greens turn to yellow, we hop on Slack. And when the yellow turns to orange, we hop on FaceTime. And that's what keeps us from getting into the red. And so this recognition that in order to do that, you need tools. You need first-class enterprise technology that's enabling the C-suite and the board to make these strategic decisions. And so in discussions and our case studies, Joseph Fuller at the Harvard Business School, speaking to the introduction of not just tech, but AI and ML that can make machine-led decisions around strat that don't carry the baggage of ego, right? Of fallibility, of career risk, right? A strategic bot can be a more truthful decision maker. On the flip side, Peter Schwartz at Salesforce, head of their strategic planning, says, hey, the other perk of having tech in corporate strategy is that you can put the tech in the hands of everyone. And so during COVID, they gave strategy tech to everybody in the org that simply let them ask questions and share insights from the eyes and ears and fingertips of the field. And taken together, theirs was a story of crowd intelligence driving strat. So compelling topic. Again, future sessions where we'll triple click, but that's the 3-minute version. Scott, over to you.
All right. And I think as you can perhaps tell from listening to Mike, there's a whole lot more detail in these client stories than we're going to have time for today. So if you're interested in learning more about any of them, please feel free to click open the report. Our next trend is about core revival. And here, if you think about what we mean by core, what we're talking about is the back office, mid office, and front office systems that keep organizations going. They range from ERP systems to CRM, legacy systems for core banking, and everything in between. And what we're seeing is, and it's again accelerated a little bit by COVID, people saying, some of what we've been doing in the past is not necessarily well suited for where we're trying to go in the future. And in some cases, we need to spiff up what we already have and improve it. In some cases, we need to replace it. How are we going to go about doing that? So whether it's organizations rethinking the way they do business cases to get more creative about what they're taking advantage of and creative financing, creatively putting systems together so it's modernizing a group of things that returns better ROI than the individual thing, whether it's looking at new technologies and techniques ranging from everything like low-code platforms and new business rules mining technology and technology that helps better service enable legacy applications so that they can be modernized in piece parts. There's a range of technologies and changes that are going on that are actually improving people's ability to get there. And then last, but certainly not least, we have in the ERP space, people rethinking the way they implement their systems. I think many of our ERP systems are loaded up with customizations. They are full of technical debt. They have a million different things that nobody uses. And so as people and organizations are looking at upgrading and modernizing, they're starting to say, hey, can we take a page from what we've learned from some of the cloud ERP systems? Can we tamp down the volume of customizations? Can we implement clean ERP systems? Can we use some of the new technology to get around some of the limitations? And I'll just share Albemarle, which is a fascinating story of how you can go from, I think, one of every ERP and several of a couple of them to a single global ERP system in the space of in sort of record time and do upgrades in, I think it was 2.5 months.
Yeah.
They show the art of the possible. I think they had something like 73 customizations, most of which were interfaces and reports. And if you know anything about ERP systems, that's basically impossible. So you can learn more in 2 weeks, or you are more than welcome to read our report. Okay. Our next trend is actually supply unchained. So if core was all about this idea of modernizing our core systems and other sorts of things, supply unchained is really this idea of digital transformation coming to our supply chain systems. Here, I would say if you look, a lot of organizations felt pretty good about the resiliency and robustness of their supply chains prior to COVID. there was a huge supply disruption in a way people weren't anticipating in most cases. And what's really interesting was to see the range of responses from organizations that recognized they had problems in hours to organizations that took months to figure out what the impacts of some of the supply disruptions were. And a lot of that speaks to this idea of being able to look at the supply chain not as a group of distinct functional silos of excellence, my supply chain function, my manufacturing function, my sales function, my procurement function, my this function, my that function, but actually integrating across all of those in something closer to real time. Sharing information back and forth, using the shared information for more analytics and predictive modeling, being able to look at that supply chain not just as a collection of individual silos we're trying to optimize, but as an overall flow that maybe can become a value driver instead of a cost center. Because now we can say, look, if we know that on one end of this pipeline, we have customers who value timeliness more than others, and they're willing to pay a premium for certain things, we can organize the entire process differently in order to prioritize those things that we know generate the most value to our clients and to us, and rethinking the way that we structure the flow of not just information, but also atoms, right? Bits and atoms through the organization to get to better outcomes for everybody. And so there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on in supply chain and digital transformation and digital supply networks. And we're increasingly seeing change in this space, and there's even more to come.
Awesome. All right, so moving into our second trio, the data stories. So the first trend in the data tier that we've been seeing is this idea of AI growing up, this idea of AI and ML turning the corner from artisanal craftsmanship, right, art, to engineering, industrialization, and lean mean science. For those who've been around the block, right, this is really about the DevOps treatment for AI ML, right? There's this old line: if you do it once, document it. If you do it twice, automate it. Well, what we're starting to see, for starters, is the automation and standardization of AI model development, deployment, and maintenance techniques and technologies, right? Going from sort of a one-off, everybody does it different, to here are best practices for the creation, deployment, sustenance of an AI ML model. Okay. The second beat here is this concurrent move from AI as the realm of single, exceptional, heroic, quirky data scientists to teams of professionals, right? We like to say AI is becoming a team sport, right? For years, the headlines and in our lived experiences, man, these data scientists are few in number and therefore hard to get a hold of and expensive. Okay. Well, top flight data scientists still are and will remain so. But properly constructed, an AI ML org has 5 or 10 data engineers who are providing the data cleaning, governance, stewardship capabilities to the data scientist so that their time is better spent on model training instead of data cleaning, right? The analog might go back to the world of there's, database developers and DBAs. Well, there's model developers and there's model administrators, right? The third beat here is really this recognition at our clients that, making a bad process faster doesn't make it good. And what we've seen and heard a lot about, right, is this emergence of AI bias, right? The thought that, okay, well, we don't know why the model made the decision it made, but it's weird, it's off-putting, it's inequitable. Well, in a world of a singular coder, you'd say, hey, Jane, fix it. But in a world where it's a team sport, accountability becomes diffuse. Who do you point fingers at when there's 32 people, in the kitchen? Thus, the need for explainable, transparent AI, right? In short, the ability to look into a model, see its lineage, and stamp out not just bias, but suboptimal decision making so as to enable tuning, pruning, and prevent model drift. So the stories here, are really stories about standards, about industrialization, aggregating data to support the professionalization, or as we say, the growing up of AI. Scott, over to you.
Thanks. So machine data revolution is the other half of the MLOps story. If MLOps is about how do we make sure that we've got all the machine learning we want and more, machine data revolution is the thing that people quickly realize. Because when you get into it, what you start to understand is that we've been organizing data for 50 years to give a small number of decision makers a small number of pieces of information to make a small number of decisions. Well, machine learning doesn't care how many data points it has. Tens of thousands of features are fine. And it doesn't necessarily have the same needs to make decisions as humans. It can do many more, much more quickly. And so what we're starting to find is that people who think about data in terms of stuff that's long lasting, stuff that can tolerate latency, and a variety of other things that are true for humans is increasingly less true for machines. And it winds up then we start getting into fascinating discussions. Are we collecting all the data we need? So sometimes we go and work with clients who say, this is great. We've been collecting outage data on our systems for years. Here's all our outage data. And we say, that's great. Where's the normal running data? And they say, well, we collected outage data. You can't train a model to know what good looks like if you don't know, or to recognize bad from good if you only know what bad looks like, right? And so there's a variety of things where we realize there are missed opportunities because people aren't monitoring the best part and the most useful part of information coming in from the web. We realize that there are opportunities because people aren't capturing information that turns out to be useful for machine learning because it's not useful for humans. And so whether it's AT&T rethinking and being forced to rethink how they store and manage data, or Loblaw and their ambition to be, as good as the digital natives in the data space, or ABN AMRO, who's using their data grid to actually connect data and stream data from real time to a central place where they can do analytics and machine learning, and some of their creativity around the nature of data cleanliness. There's a ton of opportunity that we're seeing and changes that are happening here that are really, really fascinating. Okay, so we've collected all this data, we've got all these models. Now we have to make sure that it's all secure. And zero trust, I think, is the way that we are collectively coming to as an industry, as a collection of industries, as the way that we probably should have been doing security from the get-go. So if you think back years ago, we had desktops plugged into wires connected to corporate networks, and there was no way on them that wasn't strictly controlled. Fast forward to today, we have people connecting through cloud, over the VPN. We have phishing attacks penetrating corporate networks. We have a whole variety of things that have fundamentally changed the notion of security and the sanctity of the corporate network environment. This is the traditional castle and moat approach. And the challenge is that our security policies haven't really changed to reflect the fact that we're no longer in a safe environment when we're internal to our organizational boundaries. What zero trust is saying is, let's stop, pause, take a deep breath, and rethink what we're doing. What if we assumed that every device, every system, every database, every piece of information, everything in our organization were available on the internet? What would we do differently? And when you do that, you rethink security, you suddenly start to realize there are ways of dealing with security that are fundamentally different than what's going on, than the way we're doing things today. And by doing so, the good news is we wind up not just with more security and better understanding of the systems and the organization that we support from an IT and security perspective, but in a number of cases, done correctly, it can make things more convenient, not less so. And so whether it's Takeda or Halliburton, thinking about some of how they were able to improve the accessibility of systems by actually making them more secure and secure in a different way. Because suddenly, if you're Halliburton, you are you can make systems available over the public internet as opposed to the VPN because you are more confident of their security, and that actually makes it that much easier for users to get there. And so the wonderful thing about Zero Trust is done correctly, it introduces significantly better security without necessarily a commensurate amount of inconvenience. Okay, Mike, back to you.
All righty. Thanks, Scott. And Dalibor, did you have a question, or do you want to keep that for our back 15? Whatever you prefer.
Let's keep it for the last 15 minutes. You actually triggered a couple of questions in my head. I've taken notes, and I see there are some questions coming from the audience. So maybe we will keep that for the latter part of the conversation.
Cool. All right. The beauty of the buffer. We've got the space to answer them. Hold on, everybody. We'll use that as bait to keep you around for 15 more minutes. So if the first trio was about the core, right, the changes to business as usual, and the second section was about data and information, this third trio is around people. Okay, right, the all important human on the other end of all these bits. And the first trend here is about employees, specifically the worker experience. Now listen, this would not be very interesting 3 minutes if I told you that in the future, we're going to be working on Zoom on the other end of cameras, because we already are. And if I hear the word new normal one more time, I'm going to jump out that window, right? Rather, the trend we're seeing is around this recognition that this experience, this lift and shift of old ways of working into new digital platforms is a transitional state. And we're going to look back at this in much the same way we looked at the first television shows. The first television shows were just video recordings of radio programs, because nobody knew what to do with the new medium. And so it was just the old stuff on the new platform. Well, so it goes with work, right? When our clients started grappling circa March, April, right, with the lack of face time with their employees, right? There was a trust gap, this concern that, well, if I can't see them from 8 a.m. till 4:30 p.m., how do I know they're working? Well, if you've ever heard the old quote, you can't manage what you don't measure. What we found is that digital work is interestingly more measurable, and in turn more manageable. And in turn, a lot of our leading clients have shown increased productivity with these new distributed virtual teams. Now, a cynic could say, well, yeah, that's because I don't work from home. I live at work. Sure. There's a quantity piece, but there's a quality piece. And the idea is really based around the management towards outcomes, right? The measurement of outcome activities, not effort activities, right? It's not about the ritual of going in and the appearance of martyrdom so much as documented code submits, deliverable refinements, right? Downloads, views. In many ways, the instrumentation we associate with the web is coming into our work. Now, some of the new ways of working show up as AI and ML-based coaches, right? Microsoft has debuted a coach that will review your PowerPoints to see if you're too verbose, right? They're also debuting a coach that can live right there in Teams that will say, hey, you talk too much. Let Dalibor get a word in edgewise, right? They're debuting technology that can allow for not picking the next available time, right? But the best available time. When is Scott at his best and most dynamic? I want that half hour, right? And so taken together, what we're finding is that leading companies are thinking about virtual work not as a diminished proxy for the old, better way, but as an opportunity to do new and better things, okay? Now, all that said, the office isn't going away. Jones Lang LaSalle here will tell you that skyscrapers worldwide are right at this minute being reconfigured into what we would think of as collaboration spaces, brainstorming spaces, workshop spaces. The point is the commute seems to be dead, right? But long live the office as an intentional, every couple of week place to go to do the brainstorming, unusual suspect collisions that drive innovation. So that's that trend. Let's move forward. So bespoke for billions. One of our more curiously named and alliterative trends. I take the blame. But the idea here is this. For those who don't know the term, bespoke, an English term for tailored, custom, artisanal, okay? It used to be that if you wanted something tailored and custom and artisanal, A, you probably couldn't afford it, and B, there were only so many folks doing that kind of handcrafted work, and so there was no scale, there was no volume, no ability to industrialize that. In fact, they're kind of like antonyms. Well, what we're seeing is that digital native companies, right? Like your Amazons, for example, right? Through data and all of the technologies underneath it, like cloud and core and everything Scott and I have shared with you, digital capabilities have gotten to the point where they can deliver a custom tailored experience, not just to one, but to billions, right? And so the idea is that, hey, it's not just that digital services and products are better, faster, cheaper, but they're also more tailored. And so what's the what here? What's the aha? Well, what we're seeing is that physical businesses have effectively admitted, hey, we need to stop thinking ourselves as a bricks-based business, right? With a clicks-based adjunct or a side, hustle in digital, but rather we need to reconceive of ourselves as a digital physical hybrid. Punchline being, every business needs to be both. Age-old architecture firm, Gensler, right? Largest architecture firm on the planet. They no longer go to market as an architecture firm, right? Hans Newbert here at Gensler said, we lead with design, right? We recognize that digital experiences and apps need to buttress the visit to a physical space, the experience within it, and the departure from it, right? There's an American football stadium, the Las Vegas Raiders. You can't use the stadium unless you download the app. Can't do it. They don't take cash. If you want food, you have to use the app. But on the flip side, when I go in, I get all the stats I could ever want. When my wife Barb goes in, she can get quick access to her favorite snacks. Tailored experiences at scale through the convergence of digital and physical. Let's go ahead and click forward. Okay, landing the proverbial plane here on an important topic that, as we've learned, is very obvious to some and a little less obvious to others. And the idea behind it is really this. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, right, has always been important. Okay, leaders, C-level executives, we have longitudinal trends in research here at Deloitte that says this has always been an important C-suite issue. After the social justice moment that certainly happened in the United States this past year, what we're finding is a recognition that the talk doesn't match the walk, right? 96% of CEOs say that DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is a strategic imperative. 13% say they have the ability to meaningfully act on it. Well, as technologists, this is our moment, because what we're finding is that the application of all the sorts of tools we've discussed over the last 40 minutes, AI, ML, interface tech, cloud tech, these are beginning to be deployed as a means of finding and stamping out inequity. Okay? This can show up in obvious places like job postings, looking for subtly biased language or suddenly exclusive language that might accidentally get in the way of great applicants who are, from non-traditional or non-obvious backgrounds, even applying. Within the four walls of the organization, some of our clients are using AI and ML to identify, back to the digital workplace, to identify people who are maybe being excluded, people who aren't being brought into live conversations or into team chats. Now, again, this can feel like it might have an Orwellian overtone if it's used in the wrong hands, which is why it's important it's used in the right hands, right? AI ML for good, for social good, and for the development of a diverse workforce. Now, for the few of you who might say, well, why does that matter? Well, if you need that explanation, none might suffice. But I would simply say that our research further suggests that diverse workforces drive more innovative outcomes. It's the unusual collision of non-obvious suspects that creates breakthrough thinking. And so, if you need a business case, there it is. If you don't, you already had it. So with that, 9 trends, 40 short minutes. Let's move on to the good stuff, which is the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Scott and Mike. As I mentioned, please feel free to submit any sort of questions that you might have for our guests. There are a couple that I have collected along this presentation, and they all relate to one of those 9 trends that we discussed. So, Mike, something you mentioned about the relentless march towards simplification, and I recall you telling a story last time we met on NASCAR racing and NASCAR. Do you remember the story?
Yeah.
About what happened. I think you will probably better off if you tell that story, because it's a really, really powerful, I think, parable of where we might be heading as an industry, and specifically leaders, technology leaders, CIOs who are in our audience today.
Sure. Well, and Scott, feel free to provide bills and color commentary on this, but the idea, the story goes like this. It's almost a parable or an analogy. In whether it's F1 or Indy cars in the US or NASCAR, there are so many variables, right? You have the make and manufacture of your car, you have the pit crew, you have the tuning and the mechanics, and it's all highly governed, but it's a bit of an unfair game, if you will. NASCAR ran an event called the IROC series, where they ran an experiment, namely, what if we gave every driver the exact same car and the exact same pit crew, right? And just ran time trials to see who's the best driver, not who's the best team and who's the best tech, who's the best driver. And surprise, surprise, you got a different leaderboard at the end, which is to say, in business, as these technologies become more open sourced, more third party, more cloud-based, the variety of tools we can pick from are increasingly similar. The tech that we're able to grab and put in our tool belt is becoming more standardized. And so the constructive and maybe contrarian takeaway is, as much as we just talked about tech, it's more about the driver than ever. It's more about the human talent in the leadership seat to say, which tech do I assemble and which business outcome do I want to achieve? And then it's execute, execute, execute. And so, in summary, what happens when tech gets standardized? People differentiate.
And I love that. Like, that was so true and so unveiling. And as a matter of fact, pretty counterintuitive unless you actually think about it.
Right.
And obviously we're seeing exactly that. There are clearly champions and leaders who are able to create environments that transform and lead their organizations forward. And that it at the end of the day, it does boil down to the people and how they approach things and how they think and how they act. Yeah. Very, very, very good. Very good. Thank you for that, Scott. A question about modernization, particularly on ERPs. I recall hearing you say that leading organizations are thinking of modernizations no longer as these gigantic multi-year efforts that bring in high risk, big budgets and armies of people and consultants, but rather approach modernization in a piecemeal, modular sort of fashion. That is actually quite interesting, and I think very, very new. Anything you can sort of, is that what I understood you correctly to be one of the findings?
It's so there's a lot going on, right? And to the idea that everything from legacy modernization through ERPs is somehow all the same is probably a little bit misleading. I think, Dalibor, what I would say is if you look at the ERP space, what people are asking is, how do I make managing my ERP system easier? How do I make upgrades easier and other things? Until you take the really painful step of the first dramatic simplification, you still have a really hard series of steps, given how monolithic those platforms tend to be. Although interestingly, I would also observe some of the platform providers in the ERP space are increasingly thinking that they might need to be more open to having parts of their platforms be outside of their space, right? So that's a really interesting change there as well. On the, I have gugobs of legacy code side of the world. For those of us who have, old systems in pick your favorite language of choice, I think the good thing to know is people have been figuring out creative ways to augment, supplement, supplant, right, piece parts of those systems over the years. And the set of technologies, the capabilities of those technologies, and the creativity in terms of the options that some of those technologies are enabling is actually dramatically higher than it was even 3 to 5 years ago. And so, a little bit in the spirit of the, who's driving the car analogy, I would say it really is this idea about making sure you're staying up to date with what's going on, because there really is so much new change that enables old hard problems to be done a little more easily as we go forward.
For sure. Sometimes skeptics, with a title like mine, right? Futurist, huh? The skeptic will say, what good is that? And per Scott's excellent insight, we all hear the term backwards compatibility, right? My son's business case for his new Xbox was that, Dad, it plays the old games. Okay. Well, what about forwards? What about forwards compatibility, right? We want to make sure as tech leaders that today's decisions play nicely with tomorrow's trends. And, it's very rarely that legacy renewal was because of malfeasance. It was personally or perfectly justifiable trade-offs 10 years ago that just didn't take 10 years from then sufficiently into consideration.
This is excellent. And one more gold nugget that I want to highlight is I'm very aware that you're using the word modernization as opposed to the word transformation. And I've been reminded only a few days ago when a client told me, you know what? Nobody wants to transform. No one really wants to transform, but everybody would like to modernize. So they went back and retitled all of their transformational programs into modernization efforts, right? That was pretty neat and pretty actually thoughtful way to think about it.
Global find and replace.
Yeah, I have 2 more questions coming. One is your observation on physical and digital merging and ending in some form of a hybrid. We have all, I think, observed in the last decade or even 2 decades, brick and mortar companies, retailers, pick an industry, brick and mortar companies moving into digital space. But interestingly enough, what we are also observing now is digital natives actually moving into brick and mortar space too. Amazon would be a good example of that, right? So Mike, anything like, as you project where this is heading, is this truly heading to some form of a genuine meetup of these two where they're all?
Yeah, no, well, it is. And the nerd word for this emerging convergence is the spatial web, which
Mhm.
in the plainest English is, you could think of it, at the risk of half of you rolling your eyes, think of it as Web 3.0. Okay. The idea that in order for all of this sort of mobile and then super mobile and then eventually, right, glasses and contacts and gasp, chips in our brains,
Yeah.
in order for any of that to work, we need to assign an IP address and a metadata stack to every bit, atom, molecule in the world. Now, that's a long putt, right? As a futurist, I recognize that any sufficiently advanced future sounds alternately magical or crazy. But what I'll tell you is that the baby steps towards the spatial web are the assignment of metadata to known places and spaces, right? When you go to an Amazon Fresh store today, they know you're you because of your phone, right? And they're able to paint value-added alerts and location because they know where you are in space. That's really where it's starting to head. And some would say the worst kept secret in Silicon Valley is the second round of smart glasses, right? All these LiDAR devices in our phones are paving the way for this idea of information metadata attached to physical stuff all over the place. So it's coming.
Well, and I'd say in maybe the less sort of far out nerdy kind of way, you can see some of what's already happening in the retail space. If you think about clothing retailers, you have really big stores with a certain that basically serve as the warehouse, the experience center, and the display center all in one.
Yeah.
Right? And you go there to buy what they have in stock. Well, if you think about the organizations that will drop ship you a box of clothing every month tailored to you, there's a completely different business model that clothing retailers are starting to think about. And the real interesting question becomes, if I can go see how something's going to look on the virtual model of me, and I can have it shipped to me directly, what's the point in going to the store? And the answer is the job of the store must transform from being the place I go to acquire the good because it's essentially the warehouse and the experience and everything else, to maybe the store is the experience and the procurement and the logistics and the inventory are managed elsewhere. Right? And maybe that clothing is 3D printed to fit me exactly, but I still want to go to have a physical experience with a fellow human being because that's something that I find valuable and rewarding. Or perhaps more to the point, my wife finds valuable and rewarding, and I would just like to have the thing shipped to me. But, the
Excellent.
idea is the
Excellent.
same.
Excellent. So thanks for that. The questions are coming in, so I'm going to ask a couple that are coming from our audience right now. For organizations that want to accelerate automation and digitization but don't know where to start, what might be your advice? And then there is a LinkedIn question or associated question about how do you engage the C-level executives, people I would assume who do not understand technology or see it as a cost or as a risk to be managed. How do you help organizations and executives like that start on the journey?
How's this? I'll start and Mike can chime in. Start small. I think part of the problem is everybody gets in their head what they've read in the magazines. And so as opposed to just saying, what is the smallest thing that we could do to get started that would have a positive impact? People say, how can I change the world? Well, it's really hard to do something really big because it's hard and you haven't done it before. But if you're willing just to try a couple of small things and maybe not be so wildly successful, that's actually a great way to get started.
Mm-hmm.
As for getting the C-suite involved, here's what I would suggest everybody keep in mind. If many of us, including some of us on this call, don't necessarily fully understand what AI and ML is and what all of these new artificial intelligence technologies can do, imagine how our business leaders feel. And a lot of times what we found is the first step in that journey is actually educating the C-suite, educating executives in the business as to what the technologies can do and what they cannot do so that they can become informed consumers of the technology as opposed to magazine article experts. right? And that actually, more than anything, helps people understand how to get somewhere faster.
That's actually a very, very, very good point, Scott. In our sort of parallel research on the evolving role of the CIO, we are identifying that the CIO is more and more assuming the role of a catalyst for pan-organizational change. But part of that has to be the role of an educator and the evangelist to a certain degree. And not only to the executive peers, but also to the board. In our assessment of the board's challenges, two stand out: diversification of the board members and lack of tech savvy. So the CIOs, tech leaders, I believe, have an absolute responsibility to be the educators of the executive suites as well as educators of the board, which they can do themselves, or they can actually cleverly construct a series of educational sessions relying on Santa Clauses who might be coming to town to share the gold nuggets and things of that kind, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which, by the way, also implies that a report like this, Tech Trends, would be actually a very, very powerful, great story to tell to educate the board and executives of what might be coming. Another, I think we may have a time for maybe one more question. How can an organization use artificial intelligence, AI, to inform new business model creations and benefits, and then benefit from reducing human bias is the question.
Yeah. This one, Dalibor, reminds me of of the point that we learned in our strategy engineered research, namely that getting rid of ego and career risk and embarrassment really can open up doors to challenging orthodoxies, encouraging fresh thinking, etc. The thing to know about AI, and Scott, you said it so well, right? Like the magazine grade or science fiction grade AI story is always one of like super intelligence threatening our jobs at every turn. It's not that, right? AI is about machines turning the corner from binary calculation to heuristic learning. Machines getting good at making best guesses faster than we can. What we find is that properly implemented, AI lowers the mean cost of decision-making at an organization. But what's the impediment to decision-making? It's always asking the right questions. And so like our NASCAR story earlier, what leaders need to do if they want AI to help with business strategy is leaders need to ask great questions of it. Like, hey, how can we optimize customer lift? Hey, how can we tune margin without a concomitant rise in payroll, right? If you give an AI an interesting question, right, that lends itself to optimization and heuristic, you'll get interesting answers. If you just kind of poke it with a stick and say, come on, be smart, it won't do anything. So that's how you use it, is you feed it compelling strategic questions.
Thank you very much, Mike. And we are now approaching our last minutes. I would like to take this moment to thank all of our audience members for staying with us for the last hour, and particularly to thank you, Scott and Mike. Scott has joined us from Washington, D.C. today, and Mike has joined us from Chicago. And I can, as you can tell, wearing the Alberta and Canadian flag proudly, joining from Alberta. So we have representations of multiple different time zones. So thank you very much for your attention. What will happen after this is all of you who have registered and attended will get a thank you email from me, which will include both this deck, but also link to Tech Trends, and an invitation for you to register for the 3 forthcoming sessions, 2 weeks from now, and then every 2 weeks thereafter, where we will explore each one of the 3 bands of trends in a bit more detail. This will be also promoted and advertised on LinkedIn. So please do pass the word by liking, clicking, and sharing. And with that, I would like to thank you all very much once again and wish you a very, very happy Wednesday. All the best. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Wow.
And we're out.